Welcome to this explainer. We're diving right in today because we are looking at a highly controversial, deeply polarizing document. It's called the Sovereign Shadows Report. Now, this is a national security analysis that makes some incredibly sweeping, severe claims and proposes really drastic policy interventions regarding Dearborn, Michigan. To be clear up front, we aren't here to take political sides. Not at all. Instead, we are going to look strictly at the anatomy of the argument itself. We want to unpack exactly how the authors mathematically and structurally build their case, relying only on the claims and data they actually present in the source text.
Right out of the gate, the authors drop their foundational premise. As you can see from this quote, the report outright rejects official census data. They argue that the census relies on lagging metrics and self-reporting, which just isn't accurate enough for them. According to the authors, if you want to understand what they term an adversarial or non-assimilated demographic shift, you have to look for rapid, unaudited scaling, basically growth that happens way before a host state can even measure it. They're effectively saying the official map is completely wrong, so they've gone ahead and drawn a new one.
So naturally, that begs a massive question, right? If you just toss out the official census data, how on earth do you mathematically justify the really drastic national security and demographic claims made later in the text? Like, how do the authors structurally build this case from the ground up? Let's map it out.
To figure that out, we're going to walk systematically through the report's four main pillars. First, the demographic calculation. Second, extremism and security risks. Third, systemic institutional failures. And finally, the proposed solutions.
All right, starting with Section 1, the demographic calculation, or as they subtitle it, unmasking the metrics.
So how exactly are they measuring this new population? Well, they use something called an infrastructural footprint analysis. The basic idea here is that, sure, you can hide people on paper, but you absolutely cannot hide their physical resource consumption. It's like a giant puzzle. The report claims that between 2021 and 2026, Dearborn experienced a massive disproportionate spike in resource consumption. We're talking a 25 to 35% escalation in things like municipal sewage output, electrical grid load demands, and solid waste management. Plus, they point to unprecedented waiting lists for ESL programs and dramatic surges in state welfare usage like SNAP and Medicaid. The authors argue that this sheer physical footprint makes the official slow-growth population curves mathematically impossible.
Okay, so let's break down the actual math they use for their core equation. First, they take a 2020 historical baseline of roughly 55,000 Arab and Muslim individuals in the region. Next, they add the official municipal growth tracking, which is about 11,000. But then, utilizing that 30-ish% utility and welfare spike we just talked about, they add an unaudited influx modifier of 33,000 to 38,000 new arrivals, and they claim these individuals poured in through northern and southern border pipelines during the Biden administration. When you synthesize all that math, the report reaches a realized metric of up to 104,000 individuals living within the city limits and immediate borders.
And here is where we hit the crucial point. By basically doubling the core demographic footprint in under 6 years, the report concludes that this culturally isolated group now commands an absolute, veto-capable majority of nearly 85% of Dearborn's functional population.
Moving right along to Section 2, extremism and security risks, the intelligence blind spot.
In this section, the authors argue that this dense population actually provides structural cover for radical elements. According to the text, ideological radicalization has moved entirely from private sentiment to public normalization. The report alleges that public demonstrations in Dearborn routinely feature crowds chanting hardline anti-American and anti-Western slogans. They even claim there is open praise for designated foreign terrorist organizations. For the authors, this is proof that radical elements now command the cultural and political leverage right on the streets.
And this brings us to the really acute national security threats alleged in the text. We're talking claims that federal investigations have traced illicit financial flows directly from Dearborn to militant factions like Hezbollah and Hamas, utilizing front charities and informal transfer systems like Hawala. But beyond financing terrorism, the report highlights what they view as the ultimate strategic hazard: proximity. Think about it. Dearborn is literally the physical heart of America's industrial, automotive, and aerospace infrastructure. The authors warn that in a global conflict, these unaudited, hostile elements could seamlessly pivot from financing overseas to asymmetric domestic sabotage, targeting the energy grids and logistics networks right here on the American home front.
So how is this supposedly allowed to happen?
The report outlines this concept of an operational safe haven. On the local side, they claim municipal appeasement has completely paralyzed local police, putting up administrative barriers that prevent standard counterterrorism surveillance. Then, on the federal side, when agencies like the FBI or DHS try to track extremist cells via joint terrorism task forces, the report claims they hit a brick wall. They face intense institutional stonewalling from local politicians and radical legal groups. Essentially, the authors argue this creates an absolute blind spot where local rules actively block federal oversight.
That takes us to Section 3, Systemic Institutional Failures, or the multi-tiered breakdown.
The report doesn't just blame one group, they distribute the blame down a very specific hierarchy. At the federal level, they accuse the DHS and FBI of prioritizing political correctness and community relations over hard counterterrorism metrics. Transnationally, they point a big finger at Canada. At the state level, they argue Michigan executives actually subsidize this enclave through sanctuary policies and unverified public assistance. And finally, municipally, they accuse Dearborn's leadership of intentionally severing the city's connection to traditional American civic values just to accommodate separation.
I actually want to pause on that transnational piece for a second, because the report places a surprisingly heavy emphasis on the Canadian border. The authors argue that for over a decade, Ottawa's hyper-relaxed visa frameworks basically functioned as an unvetted transit funnel. Because Canada failed to execute deep security screening on its own immigration intake, the report claims this created a massive human surplus that naturally spilled directly across the porous U.S. northern border. In their view, this effectively destabilized continental security.
Finally, we reach Section 4, the proposed solutions. And a quick warning here, the authors propose what they call hard realpolitik interventions, and they are incredibly strict and militarized.
To structurally reverse this alleged national security hazard, they demand 3 distinct operational pillars. Step 1, close the human funnel at the border. Step 2, forcefully freeze those illicit financial pipelines. And Step 3, aggressively strip away the administrative and cultural insulation protecting the enclave.
Let's look at that first pillar. The authors are calling for the outright federalization of the Michigan-Canada border. This means deploying permanent, high-intensity task forces, non-stop continuous drone surveillance, and biometric checkpoints. They want zero-tolerance deportation for anyone exploiting Canadian loopholes. Strikingly, they also demand Washington levy immediate economic and diplomatic sanctions against Ottawa for failing to vet its immigrants, essentially saying we need to prioritize continental security over economic convenience.
As for the domestic crackdowns, it gets very aggressive. The report demands a synchronized multi-agency audit of literally every nonprofit and charity in the Dearborn zip codes, pushing for RICO prosecutions against anyone utilizing Hawala networks. They also propose a universal physical verification sweep of all visas issued in the region over the last 6 years, automatically revoking them for fraud or extremism. Furthermore, they demand federal legislation to automatically defund any state or municipality that implements sanctuary protections, permanently freezing highway and infrastructure grants to force local leadership into compliance or face absolute fiscal bankruptcy.
And finally, the authors deliver their absolute ultimatum for the region. Public educational institutions and municipal facilities must be forcefully stripped of any policies that accommodate ideological separation. The report demands that local operations legally align exclusively with American constitutional principles, meritocracy, and English language proficiency. They argue this is the only way to break the psychological leverage of the radical vanguard, ensuring the community either fully assimilates or faces systematic legal and administrative dissolution.
Which brings us to the end of the report's roadmap. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty provocative thought based on the extreme measures we just unpacked. The authors paint a picture of an existential, unaudited threat requiring extreme, realpolitik interventions. But when addressing alleged domestic threats, where exactly is the line between necessary national security and the erosion of constitutional protections? It's a very heavy question, but it's an absolutely essential one to ask when analyzing grand strategy documents like this. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking those tough questions.